such a genuine gem, thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is a solved one about the Ryen family who was possibly murdered by an escaped prisoner. Now, this is a case with quite a bit of anger and theories surrounding it. A suspect that seemed perfectly matched, except for when it came to a survivor's statement. Evidence that investigators refused to test, and some that went missing as well. There's so much to this, so you don't want to miss a thing. I also want to thank our longtime sponsor, which is Skillshare. They are an online community that I find extremely inspiring and motivating, and it's perfect for this time of year with it being the new year and us having so many goals and hopes and dreams to look forward to. On Skillshare, you are able to search through so many different topics to learn from and become the most creative version of yourself. And they make it so easy to fit the classes into your schedule as well because they're short segments that the classes are broken up into. Now, the one that I have been using in the new year is a class by Michelle B. It's called Designing the Life You Want, 4 exercises for clarity and motivation. Now, these classes I have found contain information unlike I can find anywhere else, and that's why I love it so much. But there's also so many different subjects to choose from. So if you would like to try it out, Skillshare is actually giving the first 1,000 of you who click the link down below a free trial to the premium membership. So go ahead and click the link down below before you miss out, and thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this portion of the video. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1983 in California, and the Ryen family lived on 2951 English Road in Chino Hills. This was a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house around 30 miles from Los Angeles. They had started a ranch behind their home for their horses and had lived there for around 8 years. Now, Doug and Peggy were 41-year-old parents of 10-year-old Jessica and 8-year-old Josh. They were a happy family with very strong personalities. Doug was actually a former military police officer who had become a farmer, and Peggy had her own practice being a chiropractor, and she had begun it because her mother was one as well. The two had actually met at an alumni reunion 13 years prior and had been married ever since. Doug was a big man who stood at 6'2" and would keep a loaded rifle near his bed at night, but Peggy was the same way. She actually had a pistol in her bedside drawer. The couple then had their wonderful children. At first was Jessica, who loved horses and dogs and all kinds of other animals. She was also the normal bossy older sibling to her younger brother Josh. Now, Josh was the baby and would basically do everything that his sister asked of him, but he was also spoiled as well, being the baby. Now, they were actually friends because they were only 2 years apart, which made it perfect for them to be able to play together. This family didn't have enemies. In fact, their neighbors would invite them over and would be okay with their children staying the night at the Ryen family house, and that's why it made it so strange to everybody that this tragedy occurred. The next morning, the morning of June 5th, investigators would be called to the home, the Ryen family home, and a deputy would quickly report that there were 4 DOAs were dead on arrival. Yet they also reported 5 people being at the scene. Now, one was alive, but was barely hanging on and had a gash in his neck from one side to the other. He also had a stab wound in his back, but he was still breathing. And as the possible survivor was airlifted to the nearest hospital, they began getting to work trying to pick up evidence from the home. Investigators would then find blood-covered rooms and multiple stab wounds on different parts of the body, and the thing was they couldn't even identify a murder weapon because it appeared that many murder weapons were used on these individuals. And that's when they realized that the Ryen family vehicle, which was a 1977 Buick station wagon, was also missing from their driveway, and they immediately put out an APB. As autopsies were being done and evidence was being collected, they decided to retrace the Ryen family's footsteps to see see what they were doing the day prior, the night prior to their murder. And they had found that this night prior, from around 9 to 9:30, the Ryen family were at a neighbor's home, and this was because this neighbor had invited them over for like a barbecue and had a whole bunch of people over, and like I said, their neighbors loved them, so they had gone there, and then they hung out with their friends for a while and eventually left at around 11 p.m. Their neighbors who they were with said that nothing seemed unusual while the Ryen family were there, and then when they decided to leave when it was getting late, they actually had another person who was joining them, and that was 11-year-old Christopher Hughes. Christopher was actually a neighbor and a friend of Josh's, and Josh and Chris had decided to ask their parents if Chris could spend the night that night, and they said yes. Chris had said goodbye to his parents and walked home with the Ryen family, and it turned out that this was the reason for the extra person at the crime scene. He stayed the night that night with no idea that this family was going to be targeted and killed. The next morning, with Chris's mother trying to contact Peggy to see, when her son was coming home, she just kept calling and nobody was answering the phone. And so she decided to send her husband, Chris's father, over to check on Chris to see if he could come home at this point. And so he didn't really notice anything strange when he first got there. All the doors were locked. There didn't appear to be any break-ins. He did notice that the car wasn't in the driveway, but other than that, everything was normal. Everything would change though when he went to the back and looked through the sliding glass door and began to see bodies, one of which was his own son, Chris. Now, he immediately kicked in the kitchen door and realized that he wasn't just seeing things. It wasn't just his worst nightmare. This was a murder scene, and his son was one of the victims. Doug, Peggy, Chris, and Josh were all in the master bedroom, and Jessica was right outside. Now, when Chris's father went into the bedroom, he quickly realized that Josh was awake, and he was trying to talk to him, but no sound was coming out. That's when he immediately ran to call the police, but it appeared as though the phone lines had been cut, and so he had to actually go to a neighbor's home to call it in. The search for clues included 70 officers who were trampling through the home and everything around, and they uncovered 2 blood-stained t-shirts nearby. This wasn't in the home, but nearby the home, as though it had been dropped or kind of discarded. And this was a blue one and a tan one, and they also found a possible murder weapon nearby as well. This was a hatchet covered with dried blood. Now, shoe prints were also found inside this home. However, most of this evidence found was not found during the first comb through. It was found much later, even though nobody had seen it there before. From autopsies, it had been concluded that the Ryen family, as well as Christopher, had been killed by a hatchet or axe, as well as a knife and an ice pick or a screwdriver. They had been bludgeoned to death, and it was horrific. Doug was found on the bed with 37 wounds, mainly to his head. Peggy had 33 wounds on her body, and Jessica had 46. It appeared as though she had really struggled, and that is why she was in the hallway. Now, Chris Hughes had 35 wounds, and Josh was still struggling for his life as he was taken to the hospital. They didn't have time to count his wounds. They were just trying to make sure that he stayed alive. And they weren't sure he was going to survive. Blood samples were taken from all over the home, however, most of them were believed to be the victim's blood. Some blood samples did not match though, and so they decided to keep these in hopes that they would obtain a killer. They also believed that there could be more than one killer due to so many weapons being used, but no fingerprints were being found, and there was nothing taken from the home that would make it a robbery, so they didn't really know what motive it could have been. But while all of this was happening, a manhunt was happening in the area, and it was not for the Ryen family's killer. This was for an escaped convict. This was a man named Kevin Cooper. He was a convicted burglar who had been arrested back in January, 6 months prior, in Los Angeles. Now, he was using the alias of David Anthony Trotman, but he was caught and he was put in jail at the California Institution for Men in Chino, where the Ryen family lived. Now, on June 2nd, Kevin had escaped from this prison and went on the run. No one knew where he had gone. 2 days later, the Ryen family were murdered, and many began to believe that these two cases could be connected, and that the person that they were searching for as the killer and the person they were searching for as an escaped convict were actually the same person. A few days after that, the Ryen family's station wagon was actually found in a church parking lot an hour away from their home in Long Beach. There were curly black hairs found inside, the same that would match a Kevin Cooper. Investigators had also learned that around the time of the murders, a home around 150 yards away from the Ryans' home was vacant due to it being a rental home that was not being rented out at the time, but they believed that somebody was staying there. Just nobody knew about it. Yet when investigators went to search, they found no one there. However, they did find a hatchet sheath. Investigators believe that the killer or killers had stayed there prior or after or both to killing the family. Phone records from that vacant home were obtained, and this would find that 2 calls were placed the night of the murders. Both calls were from a man named Kevin Cooper, the same man who had just escaped prison. And investigators then believed they had solved a case. They just now needed to arrest the killer, and they needed to find him. At this point, it was theorized that Kevin had stayed at this vacant home, went to get a car to steal to be able to flee from the Ryen home, and that something went wrong and he ended up killing all of them. However, that is when a huge tip came in. A hotel manager in Tijuana called saying that she had seen Kevin Cooper on June 5th. He had checked into her hotel at 4 p.m., paid in quarters, and left 3 days later. From there, the San Bernardino County Sheriff named Floyd Tidwell announced to the public officially that their suspect was in fact Kevin Cooper. Now, he was a 25-year-old man, but he wasn't the only one that they believed could be involved. They named 2 other escaped convicts who were 31-year-old Alburo James Canori and Michael Fasthorse Martinez. Now, on June 9th, Kevin Cooper was officially identified as the prime suspect, and that the other 2 had basically been cleared, and a warrant for his arrest was issued. A manhunt began for him in California and Mexico, and it was said that he was a very untrustworthy person. He had multiple different identities and stories that he could tell you, with a drop of a hat, and that he was a very good liar. But the next 21 days were horrific and draining for everyone who knew about the Ryen murders, because they could not find this man. He was hiding, and he was good at it. But they were exhausted and living in fear, and they had a name to put to this tragedy, or so they thought, but they didn't have the person. Kevin Cooper seemed to vanish after staying at that hotel, and he was not popping up anywhere. Then on June 30th, a woman off the coast of Santa Barbara called the Coast Guard as well as the police to tell them that a man named Angel Jackson had sexually assaulted her. She said that she stayed in a boat that was docked, and he used a knife and threatened to kill her if she woke up her husband. Angel Jackson was quickly arrested, and they found out that he was none other than the wanted man, Kevin Cooper. He had become friends with a couple named Owen and Angela Handy in Mexico, and that is when he began working for them on their boat. Now, the Santa Barbara police contacted the San Bernardino police to tell them that they had their man, but Kevin wasn't all the police had to give. They had also found multiple different items on the boat that he had been working with that matched items that were missing from the vacant home in Chino. This connected him to being only 150 yards away from the Ryen family. When Kevin returned to the San Bernardino County Jail, an angry crowd awaited him, and they began to scream, "Gas chamber, gas chamber." Yet, even though investigators had put all of their resources into finding Kevin Cooper, they may have not been looking in the right direction. You see, the smallest Ryen, 8-year-old Josh, he had survived. Somehow, this little boy who was horribly injured had fought for his life and was able to tell his story by himself, tell the story of what happened to his family. And that's what he would do. But many say he was not listened to. You see, since his throat was slashed, he was still unable to talk even after he had survived and was recovering. So an investigator did go in to speak with him and grabbed his hand and told him, if the answer to my question is yes, you squeeze my hand. If not, just don't do anything. And so Josh knew this, and he began to answer the questions that the investigator asked him. From that, they were finally able to hear about what exactly happened that night of the murders and what led to all of this. And Josh said that he was woken up in the middle of the night by his mother screaming, and he was with his friend Chris, so they both ran in there to see what was happening. Now, this is when he saw his parents and his sister lying motionless, and he actually ran and hid in a closet. However, his friend Chris didn't make it with him, and shortly after he heard Chris crying for help for him. So he eventually got up out of the closet and went to help his friend, but was struck unconscious. By the time he woke up, he couldn't speak, but he saw Chris's father and tried to speak to him. And at this point, when he was finally airlifted to the hospital, he remembers that he was wearing Hulk pajamas that were all green, but at that moment, they were all red. And they were being ripped off of him as the paramedics tried to save his life. His blood pressure was 0/0, and yet he had made it out alive. His grandmother was the only family member that he had left, and when she finally got to see him in the hospital, she began to talk to him and answer his questions. And Josh was asking if his mom and dad made it. And when she had to tell him that they didn't, he just wanted to know why he didn't die with them, because he wanted to be with them. Investigators covered Josh's hospital room the entire time he was there because they feared that this killer would come back to finish the job so this survivor couldn't talk. However, nobody did, or it didn't appear that they got very far, of course, because he was safe. And everyone believed that the killer didn't come back because the killer was Kevin, and Kevin was on the boat this whole time. However, Josh had something else to say. You see, investigators began to ask him who he saw in the home that night that was not his family, who came and did this. And Josh told them that it was 3 individuals. Now, a psychologist was brought in to talk to him and to help him, as a child dealing with this such a horrible trauma. And this psychologist heard him say that it was 3 Mexican or white men that chased them all around the house, hitting them. Josh gave this story multiple times, yet Kevin Cooper was a black man. At one point, while they were in the hospital, a news story of this whole case was on the TV, and Kevin Cooper was shown on the screen. Josh's grandmother asked, "Is that one of the men that attacked you?" And Josh immediately said no, he had never seen that man before. Yet Kevin was being charged with 4 counts of murder and an attempted murder. He continued to say he wasn't guilty of murder, but he did say he stayed in the vacant home nearby during that time. His fingerprints at the vacant house also confirmed this, and the calls that he placed at that home went to 2 different women that he was contacting to ask for money and help to basically continue to run from where he had escaped from prison. And they both said that they didn't want to help him, and they didn't know if he ever got any help afterwards. There were also blood-stained items in the vacant home. There was like a button that appeared to be from a prison jacket that Kevin was wearing when he escaped, as well as blood on the carpet, bathroom, sink, and shower. Now, these were just like little, it showed up with luminol testing. They weren't actually blood droplets, I don't believe. But hairs were also found in the shower that they believed could have belonged to the victims, but they didn't really know. Shoe prints were found at this vacant home that matched shoes that were given to prison inmates, and they were also his size. A beer can was also found in between this home and the Ryen home that matched a pack that was inside of the Ryen home as well. But Josh was terrified that the killers were still out there. He jumped at every noise that he had heard, and he went to live with his grandmother, who began using a gun to protect her and her grandson. And they believed that Kevin wasn't responsible. However, the same footprints from a prison shoe at the vacant home was then found at the Ryen home. A sample of blood that was found at the Ryen home also was in the same blood group as Kevin, but they didn't have an exact match because it was so small, and plus DNA testing was not yet a thing. And inside the station wagon, like I said, curly black hairs were found. And a cigarette butt was also found that matched tobacco that inmates got. So it seemed to investigators that Josh was remembering it wrong, that this was done by a black man named Kevin Cooper, even though that didn't match what Josh was saying. So then why was significant evidence brushed away? Why did nobody want to talk about the fact that Josh's sister Jessica had a fistful of blonde hair in her hand that appeared as though she had gotten out of somebody's head during a struggle? It didn't match Jessica, it didn't match Kevin, so who could this have belonged to? Possibly another killer? This was the main reason why many were starting to have doubts that Kevin was the killer. And a lot of people were coming forward saying that the night of the murder, witnesses at a local bar saw 3 white men coming in with blood on their clothing. They were being rowdy, and one woman even talked to one of the men and told him, "You have blood on your clothes." And he didn't even know it was there. Then a couple saw 3 white men driving a station wagon out of town that night. And another witness said that this station wagon almost crashed into her car, and she wrote down the license plate. And when she heard that a station wagon was missing from the Ryen family home, she realized that the license plate was the same. But the Ryen family wasn't in it that night because they were already dead. It was now a year and a half later when investigators finally decided to talk to Josh again, the survivor. This time they were filming it. But this time, Josh didn't remember as much as he did before. He didn't really remember anything. Investigators had since learned that the Ryen family had 3 Mexican men who came up to them and asked them for work that day, and they were denied. And so they began to think that Josh had mixed this up in his head and remembered the 3 Mexican men from coming to his home and asking for a job, but they weren't the ones who killed them. During this interview, which was a year and a half later, after Josh explains that he had tried to not think about what had happened anymore, he claimed he didn't see anyone that night attacking them. He just saw a shadow of one man. And here is that interview.
This is Sunday, December 9th, 1984, at about 3:30 in the afternoon. We're here at the home of Dr. Mary Howell and her grandson, Josh Ryen. I'd like to take you back for just a moment to that Saturday before your mom and dad and Chris and Jessica were killed. Did somebody come up to your place looking for work?
Yes.
And who was that?
3 Mexicans.
Did those 3 Mexicans talk to anyone?
Yeah, I talked to my dad.
And then you came back home after the party or the barbecue at the Blade House, right?
Yes.
And then you went to sleep?
Yes.
What was the next thing that you can remember?
When?
After you went to sleep?
Waking up again.
And what caused you to wake up this time?
Scream.
Could you recognize the voice of the scream?
No.
Did you hear any sounds in the house after you got Chris up and started to walk down the hall?
No.
Any screams? Any yells from anybody? Any words? Nothing?
No.
Did you ever see anybody in the house that didn't belong there?
You can't really tell at night because it could be anyone. It could be my mom or something.
And when you say it could have been someone like your mom, who are you talking about, or what did you see that?
I don't really saw almost like the shadow or something.
Where did you see the shadow?
Like the bathroom's here. I saw it right on the bathroom.
How many shadows did you see?
Just one.
Just the one?
This would be his witness statement that they would use at the trial, saying nothing about the fact that right after this happened, Josh had said that there were 3 individuals who attacked his family. not just one. There was also the fact that a woman had since come forward saying that she believed her boyfriend was involved in these murders. Her boyfriend was a former inmate and a friend of Kevin Cooper. Now, the girlfriend was named Diana Roper, and she said Eugene Leland Furrow, or Lee Furrow as he went by, was an evil person and a killer. You see, 9 years prior, Lee had actually already killed a woman named Mary Sue Kitts, who was 17 years old. She was strangled, dismembered, and thrown into the river. Diane said that Lee bragged about doing this, that he only got 5 years, and while she was visiting another inmate in prison, she met him, and they began dating. Diane also said that he was a part of a gang, and that she had heard that this gang had gotten into a fight with Peggy Ryen about her horses. Diane said while they were dating, he was doing drugs, he was selling them, and they lived around 40 miles from the Ryen family home. The morning after the murders was the most significant part of what Diane said, and she said that Lee came home with a woman and she had a very eerie feeling. Not that he was cheating on her, but just their energy was very eerie to her, and she had gone in and was just doing the laundry the next day and found a pair of overalls he was wearing that night with blood on them. But she couldn't find the tan shirt that he was wearing when he left. It was gone, and investigators had found a tan shirt nearby the Ryen family home with blood on it. She also said Lee was missing a hatchet from his toolbox. Diane did call the investigators immediately, told them what she had found, and they took the overalls for evidence. However, 3 months later, they threw them away. However, some say that Diane is a professed witch who said that she saw this all in a trance and that she basically made up this whole story. Yet others believe that evidence proving that Kevin didn't do this was simply thrown away without anybody ever looking into it. Lee Furlow was actually questioned before Kevin Cooper was even brought in as one of the suspects, and this is what he claimed, that he was questioned and he was released. But he had since been talked to by 48 hours and he was still claiming that he didn't do it, that there was also no overalls at all. So this is when Kevin went to trial. It was October 23rd, 1984, and the trial began, and it included 141 witnesses and 788 exhibits. The recordings of the second questioning of Josh were shown, and outside the courtroom, many carried large signs saying to kill Cooper and calling him racist names. Now, halfway through the trial, others had corroborated Josh's first story of there being 3 people there. You see, a man named Anthony Wisely had said that his cellmate Kenneth Kuhn had admitted to being a part of the Ryen family murders with 2 other men. They were all white, and at the time of the murders, Kenneth was actually out of prison for a while, living with Diane Roper, the woman who had come forward saying that she believed her boyfriend Lee was involved as well. Kenneth Kuhn had admitted to Anthony that he was the driver that night and that Lee Furlow and another man went into the Ryen family home to collect a debt. That they were in there for about 10 minutes, they were carrying hatchets, and they were wearing gloves. They came out saying that the debt was collected and they left. Kenneth's stepmother's home was also not far from where the Ryen's family station wagon was later found. Anthony Wisely said that he believed that Kevin Cooper was innocent, and prosecutors didn't inform the defense of any of this until it was too late, and the jury was not told of this at all. So, 4 months later, on March 1st, 1985, Kevin Cooper was found guilty and sentenced to death. Appeals on the state and federal level have all been denied, and Kevin said that after he called the women to ask for help and they didn't want to give him any, he immediately went to Mexico to find his own way. Now, Kevin Cooper was born in Pennsylvania and was said to have run away from his home when he was only 7 years old due to the fact that he was being beaten. Now, he quickly turned to stealing to survive and was sent to juvenile detention shortly after. He went into a life of crime after that, and he was also accused of holding a woman at knife point and sexually assaulting her. He would create aliases and escape prisons several different times, but the prison that he was in during 1983 actually had a hole in the fence, and that's how he got out. But even the police during the early stages of the investigation were telling the public that there were 3 killers that were either Mexican or white males. But now a black man was going to be executed. Now, although things can change in an investigation, there were still things that were not being looked at to make sure that their first gut instinct wasn't wrong. Now, in 2001, partial DNA testing was allowed on evidence that had been tested prior, because like I said, DNA wasn't able to be tested back then. So the tan t-shirt was actually tested, and in 2003 it was found that Doug Ryan's blood was on it, as well as Kevin Cooper. Kevin immediately said that the blood had to have been planted. It wasn't there before the trial, and he began to fight for a test for EDTA. Now, EDTA can actually determine whether blood evidence has been tampered with. Kevin also wanted the hairs from Jessica Ryan's hand to be tested for DNA, and the cigarette butts as well, because he believed they would not find his evidence, or his DNA on there as evidence. However, the judge, Marilyn L. Huff, ruled that the test failed to undermine the previous findings and everything was properly documented by police. She said that there would also be no new trial, so it didn't really matter. However, it was said that Doug's blood contained nothing else but Doug's blood when it was tested. However, Kevin's blood had EDTA with it. However, it's said that EDTA can be found in other daily things, and it doesn't always mean that blood has been tampered with. Some of the jurors who actually were the ones to sentence Kevin to death then began to regret their decision. They have since wrote to the governor saying that if they knew all the information that they know now, they wouldn't have voted for death. An officer on the case even changed his mind about Kevin being guilty afterwards, and a warden from the prison that Kevin escaped from came forward saying that the shoe prints that were prison-issued shoes didn't necessarily mean that they were Kevin's, because in this prison, it was a lot different than a normal prison. They got to wear what they wanted. They had a lot more freedom. It was kind of more of like a humane prison. And so they got to wear shoes that the public would wear. 10 judges decided to join together, and they wrote a statement saying the state of California may be about to execute an innocent man. They believe the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Office framed him. In 2004, a clemency petition was sent to California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, and he denied this, saying that there was overwhelming evidence against Kevin. But what about the evidence that was never tested, like the blonde hairs in Jessica's hand? Kevin Cooper was then set to die on February 10th, 2004. However, the Ninth Circuit Federal Appellate Court stepped in to stop it 3 hours prior to him being executed. This didn't mean that he wasn't still on death row. It just means that it delayed his execution. And Josh's grandmother, Mary, and a grown Josh, because he is grown now, they just want justice. And they do believe, or they did believe at one point, that the wrong man was convicted. But what they really just want is all the DNA evidence to be tested to make sure, so that they can really trust that the right justice has been given. But now today, Josh doesn't remember anything about his killers or what he said, and Josh now works in construction and loves the beach. He thinks about his family and friends every day, and he just has such a beautiful soul about him from the interviews I've seen. He really has grown up to be a good man despite what he had gone through. But DNA evidence was then tested of these cigarette butts and the blood drop, and it was found to be Kevin Cooper's. Mary and Josh heard this, but they don't believe he worked alone. They believe that the hair in Jessica's hand matched someone else, a different killer, because they don't believe their family members would have made it so easy to just murder them. And not that people are weak if they get murdered, it's just that Josh's grandmother says that the family was one, every single one of them were ones to stand up and fight. They were going to do everything they could. And for it to be done all by one killer made it not impossible, but very hard to believe for them, because they would have all been fighting for each other and fighting for themselves as well. All Mary wanted, Mary is Josh's grandmother, all Mary wanted was answers before she passed, but unfortunately she did in 2008 without getting those answers. And in 2010, Kevin applied for clemency again, but this time the governor said he needed more time to decide. However, by 2015, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights found that Kevin Cooper's human rights were violated. The next year, the new governor was sent a petition for clemency as well, and this time they also asked for an independent investigation by the governor's office. In 2018, surprisingly, there was even more evidence sent in for DNA testing. However, we haven't heard anything more about that. We don't know what they tested. We don't know what they found. And Kevin Cooper has been on death row for 35 years. But this case was brought to the light and to the public more recently because Kim Kardashian actually posted about it. She also made a post in support of his innocence. Now, in an interview with 48 Hours, Kevin Cooper said he's not asking for anyone to believe him. He's asking for people to look at the evidence. This DNA that was being tested in 2018, a DNA specialist finally got back to them and said that basically the DNA was no longer testable, that it was too degraded for even modern testing because they hadn't preserved it back then because they didn't know they needed to. Lee Furlow, one of the men that we talked about as possibly being another suspect, he actually gave Kevin Cooper's team that are working to get him exonerated, he gave their team his DNA to do whatever they pleased with. But there was said to be an orange towel that was with these t-shirts that were found a little whiles away from the Ryen family home. And this was said to produce a full male profile of DNA of a man who was not Kevin. However, it didn't match anyone in the national databases either, so they didn't know who it belonged to. But it was also found that a vial of blood that investigators had taken from Kevin in 1983 to test it was completely empty by this point. And the specialist said it would have never been all used up in testing, and it was completely gone. Like someone had used the whole thing. Could this point to his blood being used to frame him? Well, Kevin's team has also found 5 witnesses who connect Lee Furlow to the murders, including a confession. So Kevin's team has since written an 152-page petition asking that the governor take a whole new look at this case and that evidence could have been tampered with. But the governor has still not responded, and the blonde hairs have still not been tested. Kevin says he still tries to have hope, but he doesn't believe in this system. He says he knows that he's frameable because he's an uneducated black man in America. Now, what I don't understand, what I don't agree with is that this whole case has been turned into attacking Kevin for his race rather than any of the evidence. Whether you believe that he was guilty of these murders, did it on his own, or was one of 3, it has nothing to do with the fact that he's a black man. But many have looked at him and automatically thought because he was black, because of the color of his skin, that he was guilty of murder. This is not okay and will never be okay. Now, I'm not saying that Kevin is this angel of a man because he has sexually assaulted women and he is in prison, or he was prior to escaping, for a reason, and he could be responsible for these murders. But what I'm saying is just because he's a black man doesn't equal guilt. And that narrative really is disgusting and needs to change. Based on the evidence tested and the evidence not tested, do you believe Kevin Cooper is a guilty man? Do you believe he killed his family, or was he framed because he was an easy target as an escaped convict? This is a case I will say I'm baffled by. I don't understand why they can't just test Jessica's evidence. She literally gave them evidence in her hand. She pulled it from the attacker's head, or so we think, but what else could that be from? And she is holding evidence within her grasp. And I just feel like whatever it turns out to be, we need to test it for her, for the fight that she put in to give us that. And we're just ignoring it. It makes me so angry for that little girl and what she had to go through. That we are just simply ignoring the fact that she could literally hold this entire investigation and the answers to it in her hand. And a hand that she had to use to fight back against a monster. And it's like nobody cares. I personally do not know how I feel really, and I would like to know your opinions. I would like them to be kind, respect other people's opinions as well. But this is one I really don't know. It is technically solved because Kevin has been on death row for so long and he was convicted, but it doesn't mean it is the truth. And fortunately, I don't know if we will ever get the truth, but I'm hoping that bringing some light to it will only help to push forward to getting that and to having someone come out and be honest. So don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.